And the first one is 7A, which is 38 Almoners Avenue on page 39 of the agenda. Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Chair. This is an item which was deferred from the last South Area Committee, and the committee will be aware that the amendment sheet contains quite a lot of information relevant to this application, which I think I ought to look at in a little bit of detail. The first point is that between the last meeting and this one, the appeal on the previous application on this site has been determined by a planning inspector, and the case officer has summarised the planning officer's findings on the first page of the amendment sheet. The key point is that the inspector dismissed the appeal, i.e. he did not allow planning permission for the 3 dwellings which were proposed on that occasion, and he did so for a single reason. And the paragraph of his report which is most important in that respect is paragraph 12 on page 3 of his decision letter, which sets out essentially that the space available in plot 1 is considered to be unsatisfactory level of residential amenity for future occupiers, and he analyses that in some detail. That is the reason why that application for 3 houses on this site was dismissed at appeal. There are some other things on the amendment sheet as well. Firstly, there are additional comments from number 7 Rothwick Way. The case officer has analysed those comments and explained how the report that she had previously written deals with those points. And then the other important matter is this question of shadow diagrams, which is the reason why the application was deferred when it last came before committee. The case officer explains on the amendment sheet that she received the shadow study. It was in statistical form, so she therefore asked also for a diagrammatic form, which was received on the 1st of this month and which has been sent out. And she summarises the comments received on the amendment sheet. The shadow diagrams are on the agenda on page 73, 74, 75. Oh, you have them separately, right. I have also put them on the wall. What they show is a limited impact on the house to the north at the times of 3 p.m. and 4 p.m. On the spring equinox. The case officer has set that out in the amendment sheet and indicated that that limited impact on the rear corner of that house is not, in her view, sufficient reason to refuse the application, and therefore her recommendation remains one of approval with an altered date for the completion of a Section 106 agreement. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. I believe we have 2 speakers on this item, a Dr. Livesey and a Mr. Mead. I think Mr. Mead's not able to attend in person but has given something to read out. Is Mr. Livesey here? Mr. Livesey, you have 3 minutes to speak on the item, and the committee manager will be timing. Sure. And he will ring a bell 30 seconds before. Yes, he'll ring the bell 30 seconds before to give you an opportunity to
So can people hear the microphone? Is that okay? My 3 minutes started. So essentially the committee, just to remind people, 2 months ago recommended this light and shade study, which we all thought was sort of a reasonable thing to do. And give me 3 minutes, I'll keep this short. I mean, in essence, I'm concerned that we haven't actually moved on in the 2 months. you'll have seen that essentially what we got here is a pretty inadequate report. The first version of the report was essentially your own planning officer referred to it as difficult to interpret. And I would go so far as to say unintelligible. And more importantly, it left out. So it was very not necessarily statistically driven. It used a bunch of algorithms which weren't disclosed. So I dug through the relevant guidelines. In essence, it skipped 1/3 of the most important part of the study, which is what's called a sun on the ground study, which was then, in response to the comments, was provided by the developer with basically 2 weeks' notice of this meeting, a quite short notice to respond. And those diagrams actually, as the planning officer comments, show a significant impact and a loss of amenity to us at 36, notwithstanding the comments of the report about the various times. In fact, there are key times missing. It's as I said to you guys before, I'm a scientist, and this is seriously incomplete. There are points where the key diagrams show the maximum impact, or the line of sight is from where the shadow is cast rather than where the shadow falls. So we're back to where we were 2 months ago. You guys are being asked to make a decision on incomplete information. And what worries us most is that all the things we talked about, that the topography of the site is such that a 1 metre drop got completely ignored in this. The fact that the houses are 1 metre higher seems to have been completely ignored in this. And the way the report was provided, it feels like lip service. And we're very concerned, actually, that the planning officer doesn't seem to have asked a lot of the awkward questions here. You know, I mean, I have previous experience, obviously, in the planning system. I've extended houses in Cambridge. And it's very unusual, in my experience, for something to simply be waded through like this. And where the planning officer has acknowledged there's a loss of amenity, there's been no effort made to quantify what that loss of amenity is. She says it's a loss of amenity. She hasn't made any use of the report, inadequate as it is, and essentially is wading this through. And there are concerns. We pointed out in the original report, she kept referring to our house being 7 metres from this plot. There was no part of this plot that is 7 metres from our house. The single story is 1 metre from the boundary. If you even measure from house to house, the maximum distance is 5.5 metres. So we're constantly getting this sort of what we would consider a real lack of engagement here from the planning process. We offered to the developers to come visit the site, they didn't bother. So there's been no on-the-ground work done at all with all this kind of stuff. So I mean, in essence, what we would like is number one, some serious estimate of the loss of amenity here, not a kind of token, it's not that bad. I mean, you wonder, why do we do this reporting if we're not going to quantify it? And in response to that, our preference would obviously be to reduce the height of the buildings beyond this metre tall. Why is it acceptable to make them 1 metre taller? And to acknowledge the topography of the site with the drop across the site. So move the houses into the boundary and reduce the height. Though, frankly, our preferred option would be not to allow them to push houses down the site anyway. Because if we go here, we're going to end up in a situation where these go here, another will go here, we're going to have courtyards all over this neighbourhood. But that's a bigger issue for you guys as councillors. I mean, we feel basically like we are essentially on the receiving end of, you know, a very interesting deregulation of the planning process, where everything that's been done to make this site acceptable for these 2 houses is at the expense of our amenity. And so the developers are basically being put ahead of any impact on the neighbourhood. There's been basically no consideration to this at all. I'll stop there.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Livesey. Mr. Collins, I'd like to give you the opportunity to respond, but is it acceptable to give for James to read out the statement from the other party first? Or yeah, so I can ask you, Mr. Collins, to do that, please.
There is an art to turn these things on. Yes, thank you, Chair. This is a statement I've been asked to read out on behalf of Mr. David Mead, the planning consultant. I'll keep an eye on myself to read this in time. It's a short statement. Mr. Mead says, "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to make this statement, as I'm away at the moment. I did attend the previous meeting when the application was discussed. The view of the committee was that an overshadowing and sunlight survey should be carried out to consider any impact on the proposed development will have on the occupiers of adjacent properties, and in particular the occupiers of 36 Almoners Avenue. We have employed consultants to carry out such a survey. They have concluded that the proposed development meets all the BRE guidance with regard to loss of light and overshadowing. We have also produced a series of illustrations that confirm the findings in the report. As I mentioned at the previous meeting, the scheme for 3 dwellings was recently dismissed at appeal. However, the inspector did make it very clear that the principle of developing the site was acceptable. He confirmed that any impact that the proposed development of the 3 dwellings would have on the amenities of adjacent occupiers was acceptable. The inspector had only one concern, and that related to the impact that the existing cherry tree would have upon future occupiers of plot 3. This is not relevant in the current application as the amenity space available for the 2 plots is much greater than for 3. The scheme before you this evening is only for 2 dwellings with a much greater distance to boundaries than the scheme of 3 considered at appeal. The issue of amenity has, to a certain extent, already been considered at appeal. The daylight assessment submitted confirms the findings of the inspector that there will be no significant impact upon neighbour amenity. The current application shows a distance of approximately 4 metres from the 2-storey side elevation of plot 1 to the site boundary with number 36. The scheme for 3 had a distance of less than 2 metres, similar to the existing dwelling on site. I therefore believe that the scheme as submitted is acceptable and would ask the committee to approve it. Thank you. David Mead, Planning Consultant.
Thank you, Mr. Goddard. Mr. Collins, would you like to respond to the points that have been made?
Well, two points I think I should make. First of all, I accept that the original submission of details from the applicants about light was difficult to interpret, but I think that the shadow studies in diagrammatic form are much easier to interpret, and I think you can see whereabouts on them and at what times at the spring equinox number 36 is likely to be affected. Obviously it requires some interpolation to consider the extent to which there would be effect at other times of year, but it does appear to the case officer and to me that the impact is a limited one. The coverage of shadow diagrams here is greater than is normally the case asked for or given on applications of this sort, in that it covers 2-hour slots all the way through this period, which is the time of year at which it's likely to be most significant. I'm not exactly sure when Mr. Livesey asks for a fuller assessment what he's thinking of, whether he feels that a list should be made of the times of day at each time of year when it would be affected, and those times listed in a report. Obviously, it would be possible to go back to the applicants and require them to submit more sunlight information. There is a risk in doing that because obviously the applicants could appeal against non-determination and then the decision would be made by an inspector on the basis of the information which was submitted to him. It is committee's decision whether they feel the information now submitted is adequate enough to make a decision.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Would members like to comment? Councillor Avery.
Presumably I have to ask questions rather than comment, but I assume the spring equinox is a series of questions. The spring equinox is the worst possible time of the year, is that correct?
It isn't necessarily the worst time of the year. The case officer selected that because she felt it would be the point at which the impact was most likely to be shown. Obviously, in general terms, the winter solstice shadow diagrams don't tend to be very helpful because everything is in such heavy shadow anyway, and the summer solstice ones also don't tend to be very helpful because the angle of the sun is high enough to limit shadowing to a considerable extent unless buildings are very close to each other. So the equinoctial figures and diagrams tend to be the ones that show more information. Obviously, the exact point at which it's worse is going to vary from one site to another according to the exact orientation of the buildings, and by seeking and gaining more detailed layouts at different times of the year, you could actually find that some other time was worse than the spring equinox, but it would tend to be the groups of times around the equinoxes where the impact of shadow on a neighbouring property is probably likely to be more significant than in midwinter or midsummer.
Councillor Avery, did you want to have any other questions?
Yeah, I suppose I don't know about anybody else, but I struggle with understanding this, and I'm not sure if that's because I'm hard of understanding or there just isn't enough information for me. And if I look at the pictures, I can understand those, but I'm not sure I want to be in those pictures. Those shadows look quite serious, but from what you're saying, actually that's limited, that's not too bad. I picture myself sitting in that house. If it doesn't take account of the topography, then that seems like a failing which isn't taken account of, which would make the shading or the shadowing worse. So I do struggle a bit with thinking that I've got enough information for myself because I think that the effect, if we're wrong, is quite big on Dr. Livesey's property and his amenity. And so I don't know about anybody else, but I really struggle to feel that I know what is right here. But I don't feel compelled just because the developer might say, well, you haven't made your mind up and therefore we're going to claim non-determination and therefore you better say something quick. I just wonder, is there more information we should be asking for? We didn't have this last time around, we asked for it. It's helpful. It doesn't convince me, if I'm honest. I don't think the fact that the previous appeal was decided in favour or rather, I don't think the previous appeal helps us at all because it was decided on completely different facts. They didn't consider the shadowing, didn't need to because it was 3 properties rather than 2, and that was the whole issue. So, as a layman, I struggle with seeing that we've got enough information. Maybe people with more experience can tell me that this is plenty enough information and we ought to be able to make a decision on it, but I struggle a bit. So I'm looking for help.
Thank you, Councillor Avery. Any further comments from members? Councillor Ashton.
Yeah, as well as the light one, it's the height as well. I mean, why couldn't the height be restricted to the current height of the current houses? So it points out, I think, in one of the paragraphs that, yeah, they are higher, they would be seen. So why would we not want to say the houses have to be the same height as the current houses so it actually fits in with what you've got? Why are we saying they can build higher than the existing houses? Or is there a fact that that's not allowed? So it's the height issue for me as well that says it's a metre higher than the existing properties, and you're going to have two properties, 3 properties there. So the bigger skyline. So again, if they were reduced, the shadowing wouldn't be as bad because you wouldn't have that problem. So again, it's that information to say. Answers.
Mr. Collins, would you like to respond?
On the height issue, Chair, I think it's difficult to argue that new building must restrict itself absolutely to the roof height of adjoining buildings if it is to avoid having a harmful effect on the character of the area, especially when we're dealing with detached houses. Obviously, in the case of a terrace, it may be slightly stronger, but to argue that a metre increase in height in itself, as opposed to the overshadowing issue, is harmful to the character of the area, I think is difficult to support. Obviously, it does have an impact on shadowing, and I'm not pretending that the shadow information that you've got in front of you shows every detail of the shadowing picture. I mean, overshadowing is a difficult issue for various reasons, including the fact that shadow diagrams usually do not take into account the current impact of lots of other things on a site, like fences, trees, shrubs and so on, which tends to confuse the issue. If these shadow diagrams ignore a metre difference in height between the ground levels on 2 plots, then they would have an impact on the shadowing, and it would be worse than it's shown on these diagrams. I mean, all I would suggest is that if you look at the proposed diagrams for 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock, you will see that the 3 o'clock one shows a very small triangle across the left-hand corner of the end elevation of number 36, which obviously implies a shadow reaching into the garden beyond the rear elevation of that house. And then at 4 o'clock, you have that triangle reaching slightly higher up the corner of number 36, and therefore the equivalent shadow would clearly run further into the garden of number 36. Now, that's the information on which you are being asked to judge whether the shadowing is unacceptable or not. If you consider that that shadow, which obviously would run across the rear elevation of number 36 at the same height initially, gradually sloping downwards as it's shown on the corner of that rear elevation, then obviously you may consider that to be a reason for refusal. What I would suggest is that it applies to a relatively limited part of the day, and that's a factor that you have to take into consideration as well. As I said before, it is entirely possible for you to suggest that you don't have sufficient shadowing information. The case officer and I feel that there is adequate information there to judge that it's not an unacceptable impact, but it doesn't have the kind of numerical information that I think Mr. Livesey was asking for. I will admit that.
Councillor Moore.
I also found these difficult. I find them difficult each time. But what I do with them is to look at the other houses. And I can see other houses that are being impacted just as much, if not more, that are already there. So when I look at that, I think, so for example, the two up on the top right-hand or left-hand corners of the diagrams, that has a massive effect. And then the little cluster in Almoners to the right. So when I compare them, I don't see this as a particularly onerous loss of light for a very short period of the year on number 30.
Mr. Collins, would you like to respond?
I don't think I can add anything to what I said before, really.
Councillor Avery.
I'm still struggling a little bit, obviously. What this seems to show is that from 3 o'clock there's a problem, and then 4 o'clock there's a problem, and then presumably it doesn't get any better after that. It just gets darker and darker because the sun continues to pass and continues to pass shade. So what we're saying is that from 3 o'clock, that's your lot, that's the light you're going to have in that part of your garden by reason of this development. I think what happens with other buildings nearby is nice to know, but kind of irrelevant because we're not considering that. We're considering how this development affects the amenity of that property, and as a difference from how it is today to the effect on this particular day, on these particular times, in this particular house, it seems an enormous change, a step change in shadowing, because he has no shadowing at the moment. So it's not that he's going from 10% of shadow to 20% of shadow. He's going from no shadow to quite a lot, whatever that is in scientific terms. But so my point is this saying that from 3 o'clock onwards, that part of the garden is in shade and will remain in shade for the rest of the day?
It's a little bit more complicated than that, because obviously the angle of the sun is changing as you move on. As the hour goes later, the sun is further round to the west. So when you look at 5 o'clock, for example, although the shadow on the end elevation of number 36 is higher, the sun has moved round to the west, so that the part of the garden of number 36 which is affected by that shadow is likely to be less, because more of the sun is coming from beyond the corner of the proposed house. I mean, I agree that is difficult to read off this diagram, but if you can imagine the fact that the sun is always moving from left to right on those diagrams, as it comes down, the shadows are rising, but also the angle of them is changing, and that will, as it goes, admit more light into the rear of number 36.
Can I just ask a question? You mentioned earlier on that there would be a possibility of having a further study, a different sort of study from what I understood that you were saying.
Well, Chair, I mean, you can seek whatever kind of shadowing information you wish for. Clearly, you can ask for it at more precise times, i.e. you could focus on, the 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock time at other times of year if you felt that was necessary. You could also ask for it to be shown from different angles, which might give you more information. I personally find these diagrams, which are superimposed on an aerial photograph of the site, particularly difficult to read because the photography of the land seems to interfere with and obscure the portrayal of the shadows. So you could certainly get greater clarity, and you could get greater frequency, and you could get additional angles, but you do have to bear in mind, as I said before, the fact that the applicant could appeal. I'm not suggesting that's a reason for rushing into a decision. It just has to be taken into account.
Councillor Dryden.
I think what I've heard now, I think we should be asking for more information on the light, because this is going to affect people. We've got to be sure, if we vote on this, to accept this development. And I think what I'm hearing now, I think I need more information on a better light survey, which I've seen in other applications over the past, which is a lot clearer to look at than this one. So I think we need more information on the light.
Thank you, Councillor Dryden. Councillor Black.
Yes, thank you. I wasn't party to the discussions at the last meeting, but my distinct impression is that the committee has not got what it asked for, and we should ask for further clarification.
I think that's my view as well, actually, that we need more information, because I think we're all struggling with it. Councillor Bluebird.
Yeah, I was here last time. We did ask for a shadow diagram to help us make an informed decision, and I'm still struggling to understand. It's not very clear to me, so I feel guilty to make a decision. I'd like to support the officer, but if I have not convinced myself that I understand what I'm supporting, I find it very difficult. So the question is back to the officer. What can you provide to make it easier for us as laymen to understand what this development is going to be, just to make it much easier for us to remove any